You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol, and I'm with my colleague and co-host Abraham Verghese for Medicine and the Machine, our Medscape podcast. And this one is a big one for me, at least, because I've been following Professor Hannah Fry for years now. And to get the chance to actually talk with her, oh my goodness, she's one of the world's leading mathematicians. She's actually pretty young to be one of the world's leading mathematicians. She's had her background at University College in London. She has a fellowship of the Royal Academy of Engineering. And I first met her through one of her books. She's got multiple books, Hello World, How to Be Human in the Age of the Machine. So I can't think of a more perfect person to have to be Medicine and the Machine than you, Hannah. Welcome.
Thank you so much. What an introduction. I can assure you, Eric, the pleasure is entirely mine. I likewise have been following your work for a very, very long time.
Well, you know, what you've accomplished in your young age is just extraordinary. And I thought because you make mathematics fun and you're such an amazing explainer and communicator, and you got series on the BBC and podcasts and whatnot, how did you break out from being a mathematician to being the kind of multidimensional person you are?
So, oh gosh, it was a series of events that I guess conspired in my favor. It was all entirely accidental. So the first thing, after I finished my PhD, the very first thing that I ever did that was reaching out outside of academia, it was just a little TEDx talk. And I was, I just sort of had an idea and ran with it. And I wrote a talk called The Maths of Love. And essentially, it was about all of the tools and techniques that I had used when I was single to try and optimize my own dating strategies. And it was very, very tongue-in-cheek. It was very silly, very playful. But every year, this is back in 2015, I think, every year, they take just a handful of TEDx talks and they promote them to being proper TED Talks. And mine ended up being one of those that they'd selected. So all of a sudden, from nowhere, I mean, I'd never done anything. And then all of a sudden, this stupid talk that I with rubbish jokes in it, like, it was very, very, I mean, I was really very tongue-in-cheek. I got in a lot of trouble for it. But suddenly it was one of the most watched TED Talks of that year. And as a result, I got a phone call from the BBC and they said, would you like to have a radio show? Which, I mean, no one says no, do they? And then from there, really, it's just, I've just always had the attitude of I want to look back on my life in the future and feel as though I chose the path of least regret at all times. So whenever I'm presented with an opportunity, even if I'm terrified of it, which I often am, even if it doesn't feel comfortable or feel like something that I can achieve, I always know that I would rather have tried to do something and failed than never have tried at all. So that essentially is the attitude that I've adopted, and hence haven't slept for 7 years.
That's a great philosophy. It's such a pleasure for me to meet you. And I have a confession to make before we start. And that is both my parents are physicists. I have an older brother who's a MIT professor and a younger one who's a computer scientist at Google. And I had no head for math, or at least that's what I told myself all these years. And then in the last, couple of days researching you and your papers and your documentaries and so on, I don't know your work as well as Eric. I just had this epiphany that maybe I never was shown how to be excited by this. And so what do you think about the teaching of mathematics? And could someone like me have been saved from this unfortunate label as having no head for math, which brought me to medicine, by the way?
And then, unfortunately, you realize there's quite a lot of math in it, I imagine. So I sort of think so, yeah. I mean, okay, here's the thing that I've really noticed. Whenever you talk to adults about how they feel about mathematics, they're always they're always very strongly one way or the other, right? They're always, oh, I love that subject. I do it, or I wish I could have done it. I really enjoy it. Or they're like, I hated it. It was not for me. That is not a space that I belong in. And I really notice you never come across somebody who's ambivalent about the subject, right? You never meet an adult and they're like, well, I can take it or leave it. Never happens. And so I have this theory that actually, when it comes to maths, and okay, as a mathematician, I'm going to think of this in a mathematical way, but I think that our attitude towards maths, when we're born, we surely are not one way or the other about how we feel about it as a subject. And so I think that our experiences end up shaping how we feel about it. But I think that it's kind of an unstable equilibrium, essentially. So the way I think of it is that one day you are just a bit sleepy in maths class and you fall a bit behind. And then the next day you're like, oh, I didn't really understand what was going on. And then someone says to you, oh, maths is boring, or oh, maths is really hard, or no one likes maths. And it sort of adds to this idea in your mind that it's not for you. And then the more that becomes true, the more it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more that you're not going to pay attention in class, the harder you're therefore going to find it, the more you're going to think that you don't belong, and the further and further and further you spiral into this feeling of that you are not a maths person. And I think it just so happened for me that I had the exact same experience, but completely in reverse, which is that when I was about 10 or 11, my mum, who, well, she's an Irish mother. Okay, so she has a very interesting idea of what constitutes fun. And she essentially made me do a page of this maths textbook every single day of the summer holidays before I was allowed to go out and play. And the result of it, I mean, like, it was not a fun experience. Don't imagine me as a child skipping along to do my maths homework. But what happened was that it then meant when I went back to school, suddenly I just had this ability. I was just one step ahead of everyone. And then when you feel like you're doing something well, it just feeds into you wanting to do it more and more. And then you start adopting the idea that you're good at maths as part of your personality. I mean, I don't think that there's anything special about my brain or about the way that I work. I just think that I had that little push in the right direction at the point in time where it made the biggest difference. And I really do kind of think that that's a tidal wave of success that I've been riding ever since.
Well,
Wow.
it's interesting because whether it's the mathematics of love or the joy of data, I mean, I think you're having a big influence of people that would like to follow in your footsteps and love math and see how it intersects with our lives on a routine basis. Now, we intersected previously indirectly because you did a BBC documentary on AI in medicine. And it was actually an amazing, I think it was an hour long, and you got into Babylon Health and the lack of data. Do you remember much about that and what your sense has been? Because obviously it may not have changed that much about the use of AI to improve medical diagnosis and care.
Oh, I mean, I have so many opinions on this. So I think, I mean, I certainly I retain my very raised eyebrow about some of the things that Babylon are doing. I think in part it's about the sort of the way that the company is run, about where they run their beta testing, about how they make their money. For instance, at the time of the documentary, I don't know whether this remains true, the way that it works in the UK is that you have these practices, these general practitioners across the country, and they get paid per person who is signed up for them. And the thing is about Babylon is that you can't join if you have a chronic condition, if you're pregnant, or I think, I may have got this wrong, but I think if you're over 65. So essentially, you can only join Babylon if you are a young, healthy person who doesn't need much medical care except in an accident or an emergency, which is fine, except that those are the patients who, when signed up to practitioners across the country, are the people who effectively end up paying for those people who do have chronic conditions, pregnancies, and are elderly. And so there was sort of like this kind of sponge that would take in all of the inverted commas, profitable patients, but without actually dealing with any of the expensive healthcare. So I had some kind of problems about the way that it was run and the way that it wasn't being regulated. But I think for me, about AI in medicine, the thing that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently, especially, is that I think quite often what happens is that the technology is really good and really impressive and is quite legitimately and understandably something that people get excited about. But I think that in getting excited about the technology, we lose sight of what the actual question that we're trying to answer is. So Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, he has this great observation. He says that people have a habit of taking a really difficult question and swapping it for an easy one without noticing that we're making a substitution. And I think that, let's take something like medical imaging, finding tissue abnormalities in mammograms. It's true that we have these exceptional algorithms that are very, very good as people at finding these abnormalities within the images. That's fine. But the really hard question that you want to actually answer when it comes to breast cancer care is whose life can be saved with treatment, right? That's the question that you ultimately want to answer. Who should we give treatment to save their lives? And that, I think, in the minds of people who are excited about the technology, is swapped for this much easier question, which is, which images have pixels that indicate abnormalities, right? And those are fundamentally different questions. And I think that in mixing them up, and in thinking that one is a suitable proxy for the other, I think that is where a lot of problems arise. And I think that really is where the reach of AI goes too far. And when we fail to realize that actually these things have to be about a partnership between human and machine, rather than human versus machine.
Yeah, that leads me to ask you about you were very candid about your own experience with medicine and your own illness. And I don't know if you know the work of Alvin Feinstein at Yale, the late Alvin Feinstein. And he wrote a very famous book that Eric and I learned in our residency years, which was called Clinical Judgment. And he was one of the first mathematicians to apply math to medicine in clinical reasoning. He had a Venn diagram on the cover of the book. But he's thought of as the father of evidence-based medicine, but I think he would be shocked by the direction it's taken, where the focus is entirely on numbers and randomized studies. And there was a quote from him that I thought of in the context of reading about your own experience. Feinstein says, "The clinician combines treatment for the patient as a personal case of disease with the concern for the patient as a personal instance of mankind into the unified mixture that is clinical care." And he really cared about extracting data from the individual in front of you, but it sort of become perverted into abstractions about numbers that you can easily generate. And your illness, for example, and your particular requirements and desires and your age and your children, these made you a very unique individual. I'm not sure and that's exactly what Feinstein meant by evidence-based medicine.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I'll say about my own illness in a moment, but I read a paper, in fact, today in Nature about colonoscopies, and about how I don't. Eric, you're nodding. I imagine that you've seen this one already. But it's this idea that, okay, of course, if you look at colonoscopies, they are the best way of assessing the need for potential care. Of course, they are, right? Compared to stool samples, they're much better. But then when people actually looked at the data for what happens when you give people colonoscopies or you offer people stool samples, actually they end up having worse results, because what you're not doing in thinking of those numbers is you are not realizing that actually people are far more likely to send off a stool sample if they're asked to than they will be to attend a colonoscopy. And I think that's just going back to what I said earlier about the question that you're asking and making sure that you're asking the right question, right? Because the question is not which is the most effective way to determine whether somebody needs, to determine whether somebody has abnormalities that are worthy of investigation. The question is, how do you how do you take into account the way that people are the people as patients, and integrate that into it to make sure that you're saving as many lives as possible. And I think that, as you mentioned, my own illness there. So when I was 36, a couple of years ago, I was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and it had got into the lymphatic system, and we just weren't quite sure whether it had established in the nodes or not. So we knew it was in the system, but whether the nodes would come back positive or not. So I ended up having some quite radical surgery, and they took out all my pelvic lymph nodes as a sort of precautionary measure. And I have lymphedema now as a result of the operation. And I think that during that entire process, I then went on to make a documentary about this for the BBC. I think it's the thing I'm most proud of that I've ever made. But I think it's exactly, it was totally and completely about the point that you're making here, which is that people are not numbers, and that what's something that you might consider a risk worth taking might not be a risk that I consider worth taking. And that if we are not taking the time and the care to really sit down with people and tailor their treatment for them as an individual, rather than just doing what the data and the numbers and the population view tells us to do, and we're not having those conversations with people, giving them a choice about what's right for them, then I don't really think that we can claim that we are giving people truly informed consent. And that, ultimately, I think was my story and the story of other people that I spoke to for the documentary. It's not to say that I would have chosen anything differently. I think if I relived it, maybe I would have done exactly the same thing. But I think that it was a clash between what was right for the population view, which is what the algorithm said that I should have done for me, versus the thing that, as you mentioned, that took into account who I was, what was important to me, and how I personally viewed my own risks.
I hope we can provide the link to that documentary. It's one of the most extraordinary ones I've ever seen about medicine, in the first person. And you were just so candid about what you were confronting, as you mentioned, the lymphedema complication that you suffered. And I mean, it's really extraordinary, and it exemplifies what we're trying to get out about medicine, mathematics, the machine, all these things that we're talking about. You wrote a piece in the New Yorker, what statistics can and can't tell us about ourselves. Of course, that was before you were about yourself, but is human behavior predictable? A mathematical analysis of what it is to be human can take us only so far. And in a world of uncertainty, you wrote, statistics will never eradicate doubt, but one thing is for sure, it's a very good place to start. That was another impactful piece. Can you tell us more about your thoughts there and maybe integrate it with Hello World?
Can I tell you actually that piece, the bit that you just read out, I had the deadline for that was the day that I got diagnosed with cancer.
Oh my God.
I went to the hospital. I went to the hospital and I got the news, and then I came home and I knew I had to get it in before midnight. And I was like sitting at the computer being like, okay, I'm scheduling crying for later. I'm just going to write this thing. So that just gives you a little insight. Okay. The thing is though, I really, in my head, all of these stories are very connected, because I think that as humans, we really don't like the idea of uncertainty. We can't. I remember I had this great conversation with another mathematician called Vicky Neal about what does 10% mean. Okay. And okay, of course, I can write you a formal definition of what 10% means, but what does 10% mean when someone says to you, there's 10% chance of this thing happening, especially if it's about you as an individual, perhaps. And the thing is, I think in our heads, what we actually do is we can't really handle that. So we sort of round it up to either 100% or 0%, right? I think that none of us are ever very good at really thinking about, okay, this is 10%. And I think that actually we make that same mistake when it comes to the output from algorithms and data. I think that if an algorithm says that something is so, if a statistical analysis says that a particular trend line fits the data, then in our heads we just sort of remove all of the uncertainty of it, remove all of the noise, remove all of the messiness, and it's like, oh well, then it's a yes or a no, right? It's like Trump won't win because it's 75% Hillary, right? Or whatever it is. It's like we can't do this in our heads, and I think that is such a big mistake. But I think that it's particularly a big mistake when it comes to, it's actually not an argument in my head in favor of more statistics. It's actually an argument in favor of less. Because I think that by truly acknowledging that we are not very good at this stuff, then I think that you have to really be careful to train yourself to realize that there is irreducible randomness, right? Uncertainty is unavoidable. And whatever the numbers say, in pretty much whatever situation you're in, it's only ever going to take you so far towards the answer. And you have to be willing and prepared to have the intellectual humility to step away from what the statistics is telling you and have much more of a human feel around it to go along with it. Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories and wonderful examples of that I think illustrate this point really well. The one that I tell a lot actually is about there's this great well, it's sort of a game really that I sometimes play with audiences where I tell them that they've just started. They're the team principal of a racing team, and they've got to decide whether they're going to race tomorrow. Okay, it's the last race of the season. It's really exciting, except that the engine in their car keeps blowing up. So in 7 of the last 24 races, the engine in their car has exploded, and they've got to decide what they want to do. So I show them some data. I tell them that one of their engineers has a hunch that maybe the track temperature has something to do with it. Show them some data of the times when the engines have blown up, and tell them that tomorrow is going to be really cold. And I take a vote from an audience and get them to decide whether they want to race or not. Everybody always, without fail, decides that they want to race. Okay, it's normally about 75-25 split in the audience, but collectively they always decide they want to race. And at that point, you reveal that actually the data that they're looking at is real, but it has nothing to do with race cars. I've actually shown them the real data from the Challenger disaster, and that on the night before Challenger launched, and as we all know, very tragically exploded very soon after takeoff, there was an emergency teleconference between the NASA engineers and management and some other contractors of NASA, and they were looking at precisely the data that I just shown the audience. This is not a setup that I made up. It's one that's been used for a number of decades to train people about revealing their own biases. But the thing is that on the night of the teleconference, like in all of the simulations that have been run since, like in all of the times that I do this with audiences, nobody stops to ask about the data that they can't see as well as the data that they can. And there's 2 interpretations of that. The first is that, okay, well, we just need more data. Whatever data you've got, you just need more data. If you've got the right data, then you can just, you'll always have the answer. But the thing is, I think once you accept that uncertainty is unavoidable, once you accept that data will never give you a perfect view of reality, I think that there is a more important view of that, which is that actually, I think this isn't an argument for more data. I think it's an argument that data cannot form the entirety of your decision. Because on that teleconference, the engineers, they were nervous. They didn't want to go ahead. They felt that there was something to do with the cold temperature. But because they didn't have the data to back up what they were saying, the managers refused to pull the launch. And so actually, I really think that this is a story about how you should be aiming always for a data-informed view of things and not a data-driven one. I think that data always has to form a piece of the puzzle, and you have to have intellectual humility about how big that piece will ever be able to be. But you have to leave room for the human element too.
This leads me to think about an interesting experiment that you did with trying to talk to unvaccinated subjects by presenting them data.
Experiment is an understatement.
In their case, they were trusting their instincts, which were totally wrong.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that experiment. It must have been a eye opener and also quite frustrating, I would imagine. We spend a lot
Oh
of time on the
gosh,
show
yeah.
talking about, we have science and then we have the public's reaction to science, and they're two different things.
They're two different things. They are two different things. Yeah. Okay. So what can I tell you? So this was it was a program for the BBC. Okay. So Big Brother, you basically lock people in a house and then see what happens. It was essentially Big Brother, but it was 7 unvaccinated individuals and me for a week. I had to try and persuade them. Now I think that, why did I want to do it? I think that I've really noticed a lot about scientists that there can be a bit of snobbery
Yeah.
about people who don't immediately understand things in the same way that scientists do, and arrogance, actually, I think. And I think I'm making this argument in favor of intellectual humility. I think scientists are just as capable as other people of making massive mistakes and misunderstanding things. I mean, reproducibility crisis, to point out one thing. And I think that what I noticed during COVID was that there was this hard division between the people who were right, in inverted commas, and the people who were wrong, in inverted commas. And I think that I really care about society being better. And I really care about trying to make it so that science has the biggest possible impact and the best possible value for everybody. And I think that means that you can't just decide to ignore a section of society who are not going with you. And I think it means you can't just look down on people and call them idiots. But I also think that actually, if you want to ensure that more people are vaccinated, I think you also just you can't not listen, right? I think you have to do the work of listening to people, but listening in a way where you're not just trying to think of the next thing that you're going to say to them. I think you have to listen to really hear what it is that they're saying. And the thing that I noticed in spending this time with these people, many of whom I would happily go to the pub for a drink with them, right? Many of them, I got on really well with almost all of them. And I think all of them had valuable contributions to make and had interesting things to say. I learned from every single one of them. But the thing that I realized is that actually, even though when we started, it felt like we were completely poles apart, right? I am fully vaccinated. My children are vaccinated. I very strongly believe in the vaccination program. I struggle to see how rationally you cannot, right? I'm on that side of the argument. But by the end of it, I realized that actually we agreed on almost everything. We agreed that the pandemic had been terrible. We agreed that we didn't want people to die. We agreed that we didn't want people to be harmed unnecessarily by medication that they didn't necessarily need to take. We agreed on informed consent. We agreed that lockdowns were horrendous. On all of these things, we agreed. And ultimately, what it actually came down to was that the only thing we disagreed on was how you count whether an illness is after a vaccine or because of the vaccine, right? We even agreed on the number of people who had illnesses, but it was just whether it was causal. That was literally it. On every other thing we agreed. But I think that there were other things that they were telling me that I realized that in the arrogance of scientists, and I don't know whether this is how it worked in the States too, but here certainly I realized that the arrogance of people just assuming that everybody would be on board with this vaccine program, and I think we'd made some really big mistakes. So for example, there was one woman there, she was easily my favorite. She was absolutely brilliant. She's this young pregnant Black woman from Lambeth in London, and she was saying that for starters, she pointed out, which I think is a completely fair point, because there'd been lots of campaigns directly targeting young Black men specifically in Lambeth. She was like, look, what have the government ever done for young black men in Lambeth? And all of a sudden you want them to take this back? Like, come on, right? But that aside, I mean, she was doing it in a kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek way too, I think. But that aside, she pointed out that these vaccine centres that have been constructed, there were perspex screens between every booth. There were people wearing plastic aprons and masks and white coats. And then there was a queue and a person going around with a clipboard. And she said that when she went into that environment, it felt like she just walked into a prison. And she was like, it's very triggering to be in that environment. And why would I voluntarily, for something that I'm already quite scared about, why would I voluntarily enter into that environment if I don't have to? And it just had never occurred to me to view that setting in that kind of hostile way, because it didn't feel hostile to me. And I just think, look, I don't know whether I should have done that program. I don't know whether it had any good, but overall, I don't know whether in the end I just made things worse. But I do think that scientists in general should spend a bit more time listening and a bit less time looking down on people who don't see the world in the same way as they do.
Right. Or hubris and preaching and that sort of thing. But that gets me to a different effort that you took on, which was a series of podcasts with DeepMind.
Yeah.
Recently, I had the chance to interview like this Demis Hassabis, which I kind of think of him as like the Da Vinci of our times or something. He's brilliant, right?
He really is.
But what obviously AI for life science is a different animal than what we've been talking about in medicine, like this AlphaFold for predicting protein sequences for amino acids. I wonder what your thoughts are, because they're right there in London, and they're certainly a leading edge of AI, and they're not so much in medicine as they are in other areas. What do you think about their efforts?
I mean, I've drunk the Kool-Aid, unfortunately. I am as you are, just blown away by how impressive Demis is. But not just about how smart he is. I mean, he's incredibly smart, right? He's got really good ideas. He's got an incredible team of extremely intelligent scientists around him. And that's very impressive. But the thing that I really am impressed by is that they are doing all of this with that idea of intellectual humility, I think. I think that they are deliberately building in things in their models as much as possible, so that their models are wearing their uncertainty with pride. I think that they have psychologists on site who think very carefully about how to set up their system so that it doesn't end up falling into the classic traps of human bias. And I also think that they are not thinking of, I think that they know that their systems are going to have problems, right? And I think that they are committed to continually hunting for what the problems might be, rather than like very quickly releasing something, in beta mode, and then worrying about the wider implications of it later. It's the ethical stuff that I do find, look, I'm not saying that they're never going to make a mistake, but I think that they are genuinely committed to thinking about things ethically as much as they can. And that, I think, is really impressive. Just the fact that they publish everything, right? I mean, the fact that they're committed to peer review. I think that really illustrates the kind of mindset that they have, and that, I think, is really admirable in a world where actually people probably wouldn't notice or complain if they didn't. And so I think the fact that they are committed to doing that, I think that does demonstrate something kind of impressive about Demis's vision.
So I have a question. Do you sort of react to the world around you, or is it fair to ask you, what are you working on and looking towards in the future? Because it seems to me that a lot of your work is this exciting reaction to something that's just happened, whether it be dating or marriage or vaccine deniers. So what's on your horizon, or does it depend on what happens, what crosses your radar next?
Well, okay, so Stephen Strogatz, mathematician, American mathematician, he's got this phrase where he says that he's intellectually promiscuous. And I really like that phrase, so I'm stealing it. I'm stealing it and saying that I am too. So in part, I think it's the types of things that that catch my attention are often reactionary because I live in this world, I'm part of it, and want it to be better. But it's interesting that you asked me this question because I, in fact, have just finished filming a series for Bloomberg, that's coming out in February, and it's called The Future. And essentially, it's about trying to do this whole process of thinking of the impact of technology on society, but trying to do it in a forward-looking way rather than necessarily a backwards-looking way. So it's looking at things that are in the short, medium, and longer term, but the way that it will shape the world, really. But it's not a kind of happy, clappy, enthusiastic, jolly jaunt off into the future. This is supposed to be, I think of them, Eric, a little bit like those New Yorker essays that you mentioned earlier. I like to think of them as they are these 24-minute long video essays that are challenging and don't necessarily have all of the answers, but that are at least asking the right questions of the technology that is being developed, so that we don't end up having to be reactive and think of these questions retrospectively.
Yeah, Abraham took my question by I was going to say what's next for Professor Fry, but that's just for February. We anticipate so much more in the decades ahead from you. I mean, my goodness, this has been a real treat to have a chance to get firsthand your amazing communication skills. I mean, no wonder the BBC figured out, hey, we got a good one here. It's extraordinary. I mean, how you can explain things and make it fun and make it enthralling, in fact. So we will continue to follow you, learn from you. Hopefully you've augmented your US audience here, warming them up for the Bloomberg series.
Exactly.
But I think what we have to do is get those BBC productions to be shown in the US. Otherwise, we have to beg somebody like you or Pierce Keene or somebody, send it to me, send me the full video. But they should understand that the work you're doing is not just for BBC, it's important for everyone. So I'm glad Bloomberg has figured out, and I know many others are going to over time. What a talent. So Hannah, thank you for everything you're doing. And we'll hopefully come back to you in the times ahead to get the next version, the next edition.
Well, right back at you, Eric. Thank you for everything you're doing as well. What an absolute treat to join you both on this. Thank you so much.